All right, get ready to dive deep, folks, because today it's all about the philosophy of science. We've got some excerpts from a book about two pretty influential figures, Imre Lakatos and Paul Feyerabend.
Yeah, they really shook things up, these two, not afraid to question, the very foundations of how we do science.
We're talking 20th century philosophers here,
Yeah.
and both were influenced by Karl Popper, right? But they took his ideas in some seriously different directions.
Oh, absolutely. Lakatos, he was all about refining that falsificationism, making
Sure.
it super rigorous. But Feyerabend, he was like a philosophical rebel. He championed this anarchistic view of science.
And here's the thing that just blows my mind.
Yeah.
They were close friends. Like, imagine the debates at their dinner parties.
Oh, can you imagine a clash of titans, but all friendly-like? But their friendship, I think, shows this shared passion for understanding science, even if they disagreed on, like, the how.
So in this deep dive, what we're going to try to do is unpack their core arguments, see where they diverged, and maybe even challenge some of our own assumptions about what makes science, well, science. Sound good?
Sounds like a plan. A good place to start might be this problem of demarcation. Both Lakatos and Feyerabend, they really wrestled with this.
Demarcation. Okay, for those of us who haven't been, pondering philosophy in our spare time, break that down for us.
It's the age-old question, right? What makes a theory scientific?
Yeah.
Where's that line between real science and pseudoscience?
So we're talking about, like, sorting the wheat from the chaff. I'm guessing this isn't as easy as it sounds, though.
You got that right. Lakatos actually identified three main approaches to this whole problem. First, you've got demarcationism, which tries to set some specific criteria a theory has to meet, right, to be considered scientific.
Like a checklist for good science.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
Then you've got elitist authoritarianism, which basically says, leave it to the experts. The scientific elite, they get to decide what's legit and what's not.
A bit of a we know best vibe there.
Exactly. And then, and this is where things get interesting, there's epistemological anarchism. That was Feyerabend's baby.
Anarchism in science. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What does that even look like?
So Feyerabend, he argued there's no fixed method, no universal set of rules that defines science. He actually thought scientists often break the rules, and sometimes, they have to break them to make those truly groundbreaking discoveries.
It's a bit of a Wild West approach to knowledge. No rules, just results.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that, but Feyerabend definitely felt that, sticking too rigidly to any method could actually hold science back. And the text, it gives us some really great examples to think about this whole demarcation thing, like, that classic Darwin versus creationism debate.
Oh yeah, that one's still raging on in some circles.
Absolutely. And the book also mentions Marxism and psychoanalysis. Both have been challenged, in terms of their scientific validity.
So where would someone like Feyerabend stand on those examples? Would he say they're all fair game in the pursuit of knowledge?
He'd definitely be against shutting down ideas prematurely. I think he'd argue that even ideas that seem, unscientific on the surface could actually end up contributing to scientific progress in some way.
Okay, I'm starting to see why these two were such a fascinating pair. One pushing for order, the other embracing a bit of chaos. But before we get too deep into Feyerabend's anarchy, let's circle back to Lakatos. What was at the heart of his approach?
Well, Lakatos, he was a serious critic of a lot of the established philosophies of science. He went after inductivism, conventionalism, even different types of falsificationism, arguing that they all fell short in some way.
Not one to shy away from a philosophical debate, it sounds like.
Definitely not. He really wanted to find a more, I guess you could say, a more robust way to understand how science actually moves forward. That's what led him to develop this methodology of scientific research programs.
Okay, break that down for me. What exactly is a research program in Lakatos's view?
He saw science not as just a bunch of separate theories, but as these competing research programs. Each program has a few key elements. There's the hardcore, which is basically the fundamental principles. Those are non-negotiable.
So that's like the bedrock of the program, the stuff you just don't mess with.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the protective belt, which is this set of hypotheses, more like auxiliary hypotheses that can be tweaked,
Yep.
adjusted to kind of protect that hardcore from being falsified.
So those are the more flexible parts, the shock absorbers of the program.
Exactly. And then finally, you have heuristics. Those are basically the rules or guidelines for how you develop that program. Lakatos talked about negative heuristics, which tell you what not to do, and positive heuristics that guide you towards, promising areas of research.
So it's a much more dynamic view than just testing individual hypotheses one at a time.
Oh, absolutely. Lakatos saw these research programs as constantly evolving, being refined in response to new evidence, new challenges, and he really believed that this competition between research programs, that's what drives scientific progress.
I'm starting to see how his approach captures that kind of messy back and forth that happens in real science.
Mhm.
But how do we know if a research program is actually succeeding? Like, what's the measure of success?
That's where Lakatos's distinction between progressive and degenerative research programs comes in.
Okay, I'm all ears. Progressive versus degenerative. What's the difference?
A progressive research program is one that predicts new facts. It expands our understanding, opens up new avenues of inquiry. It's pushing the boundaries of knowledge.
So it's not just explaining what we already know, it's leading to actual new discoveries.
Exactly. A degenerative program, though, it's more about just explaining away anomalies. It's kind of reinterpreting data to fit what it already believes without really generating any new insights.
So it's more about defending its own position than actually making progress.
Exactly. And Lakatos believed that over time, these progressive research programs, they tend to outcompete the degenerative ones. They just offer a more compelling way to understand the world.
This is giving me a whole new way to think about the history of science. It's not just this linear march towards the truth, but this constant battle of ideas with some programs winning out while others, they kind of fade away.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Lakatos's framework helped us understand why certain theories persist, even when they face, challenges, and why others are eventually abandoned. It all comes down to whether that program can keep generating new knowledge, new insights.
This is fascinating stuff. But I have to say, I'm also really curious to hear more about Feyerabend's perspective on all of this. How does his anything goes approach fit into this whole picture?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. See, while Lakatos was all about building these structured frameworks, Feyerabend was kind of all about breaking them down, questioning those assumptions. He probably would have said that Lakatos's approach was still a bit too restrictive, too focused on imposing order on something that's inherently messy, like the way science actually happens.
So you'd say there's more to science than just following the rules, trying to fit everything into neat little boxes.
Absolutely. He thought the truly groundbreaking stuff often comes from those who, they dare to challenge what everyone thinks they know. They think outside the box. They embrace these unconventional approaches. He even thought there was a place for intuition, creativity, even a little bit of trickery sometimes in making scientific progress.
Okay, now I'm really ready for a deep dive into Feyerabend's world of scientific anarchy. Let's hear it. Okay, so let's get into some of that Feyerabendian anarchy. Where do we even start with this anything goes idea in science?
Well, Feyerabend, he loved using historical examples to make his point. And one of his most famous arguments is all about the scientific revolution, like specifically Galileo.
Galileo, the one who said, hey, the Earth goes around the sun. Yeah, that was pretty revolutionary for his time, right?
Exactly. And Feyerabend's point was that Galileo, he didn't just have the right theory. It was more than that. It was his willingness to, break the rules, to challenge the established scientific method.
So he was a bit of a scientific rebel, huh?
You could definitely say that. Feyerabend pointed out that Galileo, he used all sorts of tactics to get his ideas across. Some of them, well, they wouldn't exactly fly in science today. He used rhetoric, emotional appeals, maybe even a little propaganda, you could say, to convince people.
So it wasn't all just, cold, hard data and logic. There was a bit of showmanship involved.
Oh, absolutely. Feyerabend argued that sometimes to get a truly revolutionary idea heard, you gotta get creative, even maybe a bit manipulative. He thought that Galileo's willingness to bow those rules, that's actually what allowed him to overturn that whole geocentric view of the universe.
That's a pretty wild way to think about scientific progress.
Yeah.
It's not just about having the right data. It's about convincing others.
Yeah.
Getting them to see things in a new way.
Exactly. And Feyerabend, he didn't stop there. He actually thought this kind of rule-breaking, it's not just a historical quirk. He said it's essential to how science always moves forward. He even came up with this term counterinduction to describe it.
Counterinduction. Okay, now you got to break that one down for me.
Basically, it means we should be actively challenging those established theories, even the ones that seem, totally solid. Feyerabend thought that by doing that, by questioning what we think we know, we can uncover those hidden assumptions, those biases, and maybe even see the limitations in our current understanding.
So it's like, don't get too comfortable with what you think you know, right? Keep pushing those boundaries.
Exactly. He said this kind of, contrarian thinking, that's what leads to those breakthroughs that wouldn't happen if everyone just, followed the rules all the time.
It makes me think about all those stories about, scientific discoveries that happened by accident, or when someone went against the grain, tried something no one else thought of.
And Feyerabend would say those aren't just flukes, They're proving his point. Letting go of those rigid methods, having a more open-ended approach, that's what leads to real discovery.
Okay, I'm starting to see the appeal of a little bit of scientific anarchy, But I also wonder about the whole, the rigor of science. Don't we need careful observation, experimentation, analysis? Wouldn't anything goes just lead to chaos?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. And I don't think Feyerabend was saying to just throw all the methods out the window, He understood that we need rigor, we need testing. But he thought those tools, those methods, they shouldn't be like handcuffs. They should be more like guidelines, something that can be adapted, even broken when you need to.
So it's more about finding that balance between, like, structure and freedom.
Yeah, I think so. He argued that the best science, it comes when you combine that deep respect for empirical evidence with a willingness to question everything, and to explore those unconventional ideas.
I like that. It's like he's calling for a kind of scientific creativity. Like, you got to be playful, experiment with ideas and methods.
That's a great way to put it. He really saw science as this human thing, driven by curiosity, imagination, passion. And he thought that human element, it shouldn't be stifled by all these rules and dogmas.
That's a really refreshing way to think about it.
Right.
Because so often science is presented as this, this cold, objective thing. But Feyerabend's saying, hey, there's passion here, there's creativity, there's even a little bit of mischief.
Exactly. He thought we should celebrate that human side of science, not try to hide it. And that's what leads to those really profound discoveries, Embracing the messiness, being willing to break the rules when you have to.
I'm really starting to appreciate all those scientific rebels throughout history.
Yeah.
The ones who dared to challenge what everyone else thought.
Hmm.
But I also wonder, how does this anything goes idea play out in different fields of science? Like, does it apply the same way to, say, physics as it does to sociology?
Ooh, that's a great question. And it takes us into some really interesting territory. Because, Lakatos and Feyerabend, they were mostly focused on the philosophy of science in general. But their ideas, they've really sparked a lot of debate about those differences between what we call the hard sciences and the soft sciences.
Right. Because, like, hard sciences, things like physics and chemistry, they deal with things that are easier to measure, right?
Yeah.
But those soft sciences, like sociology, psychology, economics, they're dealing with all the complexities of human behavior.
Exactly. And some people have argued that Lakatos, his more structured approach, with the research programs and falsification, that it fits better with those hard sciences. Because you can do those controlled experiments, test your hypotheses more easily.
So they'd say Feyerabend's more anarchistic approach, that might be a better fit for those soft sciences where things are, messier, less predictable.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. But it's important to remember that both Lakatos and Feyerabend, they were really trying to get us to have a more sophisticated understanding of science as a whole. They weren't trying to draw these hard lines between different fields.
So it's not about saying one approach is right for one kind of science and wrong for another.
Exactly. It's more about recognizing that, different fields might emphasize different parts of that scientific process, but those core principles, curiosity, rigor, being willing to question your assumptions, those apply no matter what you're studying.
This makes me wonder how Lakatos and Feyerabend would have debated this. I can just imagine them going back and forth about how their ideas would apply to different fields.
Oh, I can totally picture that. Lakatos with his sharp mind,
Yeah.
always trying to systematize everything, arguing for those universal frameworks. And Feyerabend, the playful one, pushing back against any attempt to define things too rigidly.
I would have loved to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. But their debate, it also highlights something really important. Even in philosophy, even when talking about science, there's room for disagreement, for different perspectives, and for constantly questioning, even our own assumptions.
And that's what makes it so great, right? It's not about finding one right answer to the question, what is science? It's about having that conversation, that ongoing exploration of how we come to understand the world with all its complexity and, its wonder.
This is really making me rethink my whole idea of what science is. It's not just about memorizing facts from a textbook, It's about being curious, questioning everything, being open to seeing things in new ways. It's about recognizing that human element in science, the creativity, the intuition, even that little bit of healthy rebellion, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Man, we've been on quite the journey with Lakatos and Feyerabend, really digging into the nitty-gritty of what it means to do science.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From those, strict rules of traditional science to the wild world of anything goes.
So as we wrap things up, maybe we can try to sum up some key takeaways. What are the big ideas we want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, we started with that whole question of demarcation, right? How do we decide what's actually scientific? Lakatos, he gave us those 3 categories to think about. Demarcationism, elitist authoritarianism, and of course Feyerabend's favorite, that epistemological anarchism, each with their own way of drawing that line, between science and pseudoscience.
And even within that demarcationism, Lakatos, he wasn't afraid to critique, was he? Finding flaws in, well, pretty much everything. Inductivism, different versions of falsificationism.
Oh, he was tough, always pushing for more rigor, more clarity. But he didn't just tear things down, He had gave us that whole methodology of scientific research programs, a much more, sophisticated way to look at how knowledge really progresses.
Right, with the hardcore, that set of principles that you just don't touch, and the protective belt of those auxiliary hypotheses that can be, tweaked and adjusted, and of course those heuristics, positive and negative. It's almost like a blueprint for how scientific ideas come about, change, and sometimes, just disappear.
It also gives us some insight into why scientists sometimes hang on to theories even when the evidence seems to contradict them, They're protecting that hardcore, trying to keep that research program alive and producing results.
But then we have Feyerabend, right, our champion of anarchy, reminding us that sometimes you got to break the rules to make progress. He said that being too strict, sticking to any one method no matter what, well, can actually stifle that creativity and the accidental discoveries that often lead to the biggest breakthroughs.
And his example of Galileo, that's a perfect illustration, isn't it? Using rhetoric, even a little bit of trickery to get people to accept his heliocentric model. Feyerabend loved that. He said that pure logic and reason, they aren't always what drives scientific progress.
He gave us that great concept of counterinduction, right? Deliberately challenging what we think we know, to uncover those hidden assumptions and, maybe see things in a whole new light. He wanted us to embrace that messiness, that creative impulse that drives discovery.
And both Lakatos and Feyerabend, despite their, very different approaches, they both challenged that simplistic idea of science as just this purely objective, emotionless pursuit of truth.
Right. They saw the human side of it, the personalities, the power dynamics, the whole art of persuasion. They were saying that science is a product of its time, shaped by all these social and cultural forces.
And that brings up some pretty big questions, doesn't it, about how science functions in society. Who gets to decide what's valid? Who gets heard and who gets ignored? Whose interests are being served by the research that gets funded?
In Feyerabend, he never shied away from a provocative idea, did he? His call for a separation of science and state, that was a big one. He didn't want any one system of knowledge, even one as powerful as science, to become too dominant, too unquestioned.
Yeah, it's a radical idea, no doubt, but it makes us think critically about the power structures that shape how we see the world.
So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, what's the parting thought we leave our listeners with? What's that gem we hope they'll carry forward?
I think the most important thing is to remember that science isn't, some static set of facts. It's a process. It's constantly changing, sometimes making mistakes, and always, always influenced by the humans who drive it.
It's an invitation to be curious, right? To question everything, even the things that seem completely settled, to have a little bit of that Feyerabendian spirit, challenge the status quo, but also to appreciate those frameworks that Lakatos gives us for understanding how knowledge grows and changes.
And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, well, there's a whole world out there to explore. Feyerabend's against method and Lakatos' proofs and refutations, those are great places to start.
Yeah, let their ideas be the launching pad for your own intellectual journey. Who knows what amazing insights you might discover.